Okay, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about the lateral wall of the nose. So in the previous video, we saw that the nasal cavity, it lies superior to the oral cavity and anterior to the nasopharynx. It is divided into two halves by the presence of a median nasal septum, which divides the nasal cavity into the right half and the left half. Now we also saw that the nasal cavity has a floor formed of the hard palate, a roof, and because of the division by the nasal septum, it had a medial wall and a lateral wall. So in this video, we will continue talking about the lateral wall. Now, if we look at the lateral wall from a sagittal section, we see that it's quite complex and it is formed of bone, cartilage, as well as soft tissues. Much of its complexity can be attributed to three shelves or conchae, also known as turbinates, which are bony projections covered by mucous membrane. Between these conchae, we have the presence of the nasal passages, which are the meatuses. Now we'll come back to this in a minute, but let's first talk about the relations of the lateral wall. Now when we look at the lateral wall anteriorly, and if we take a coronal section of it, that is, I cut it as such and view it anteriorly, I would see that the lateral wall separates the nose from above the orbit, inferiorly the maxillary sinus, and from the lacrimal groove and the nasolacrimal canal. So let's see it in this diagrammatic representation. You can see that superiorly it separates the nose from the orbit, inferiorly from the maxillary sinus, and extending towards the inferior meatus, we have the nasolacrimal duct. Now coming to the contributions of the lateral wall, okay, so the main bony components that form it, let's see it in the coronal section. First of all, what I want to mention is, in this section, the medial thing that you see is the nasal septum, right? So the superior part of that is formed by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and inferiorly we have the vomer, right? So this is the nasal septum that we have discussed in the last video. Lateral to that is our lateral wall. Now, first of all, this entire bone is the ethmoid, and ethmoid has three parts. Superiorly, it has the cribriform plate, inferiorly, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and here is the ethmoidal labyrinth. So this is a structure of our concern in this video because we get our superior concha and the middle concha as extensions from the ethmoidal labyrinth, right? So if we see, the superior concha and the inferior concha come from the ethmoidal labyrinth. Then we have the uncinate process. We have the inferior concha, which is an independent bone. And also we receive contributions from the medial pterygoid plate of sphenoid, the lacrimal bone, and the maxilla, right? So far in the coronal section, we have seen all the bones contributing to it. Apart from that, there are a few cartilages as well which contribute to the lateral wall, being the lateral cartilage, the greater alar cartilage, and a few minor cartilages, right? So with this knowledge, let's proceed on to the areas of the lateral wall of the nose. So this is also a sagittal section like this, but in this section we have the coverings of the mucous membrane. So in this we see that the anterior-most part is depressed and it is called the vestibule. It also contains vibrissae or the nasal hairs. The middle part is the atrium of the middle meatus, and posterior to that we have the posterior part which contains our conchae, separating the spaces which are called the meatuses. With this knowledge, we can finally proceed on to the conchae and the meatuses, which is also the most important topic of our lateral wall of the nose. So as we've already discussed in the coronal section, we saw that there were certain projections from the ethmoidal labyrinth, which were the superior concha and the middle concha, and the inferior concha was a separate bone. Now we see that these conchae, they're basically directed inferiorly and medially, right? So they're directed medially and they're directed inferiorly, and between them the passages that form are the meatuses. So these basically form the air passages. Now the function of the conchae is, you would notice that certain, as they come medially and inferiorly, they're basically increasing the surface area, right? So this is the nasal cavity. They're increasing the surface area of the inspired air. So this allows better humidification of the air. Apart from that, because they also slow down the turbulence of the air, they allow better humidification and moistening of the air. Now coming to this diagram, you can very well appreciate the three meatuses, which are the superior, the middle and the inferior. Sorry, you can appreciate the three conchae, which are the superior, the middle and the inferior conchae. And beneath them, we have the nasal passages, which are the superior meatus, the middle meatus and the inferior meatus. Now let's study each of these meatuses one by one. Now what makes these conchae and these meatuses so important is that various paranasal sinuses and the nasolacrimal duct, they enter the nasal cavity and give their secretions here. So starting with the three conchae, which are the superior, the middle and the inferior conchae, and between them are the nasal passages, which are the superior meatus, the middle meatus and the inferior meatus. Now coming to the inferior meatus, right? If I were to cut the inferior concha and reveal the inferior meatus, we would notice that it is the largest of the three meatuses, right? It is the largest of the three meatuses, as you can visualize here, the smallest being the superior meatus. So it is the largest of the three meatuses, and at the junction of its anterior 1/3 and the posterior 2/3 is our opening of the nasolacrimal duct, right? So let's zoom into this diagram for a bit. So we see that the nasolacrimal duct, it carries tears from the conjunctival sac. So it begins at the lacrimal sac of the eye into the nasal cavity, and its opening is guarded by the lacrimal fold or the Hasner's valve. So this nasolacrimal duct basically opens in the lateral wall of the nasal cavity in the inferior meatus at the junction of the anterior 1/3 and the posterior 2/3. Now coming to the more complex middle meatus, we have a lot of structures here. If I were to cut the middle meatus and view it so, right? So we have cut the middle meatus. Here you can see the cut middle meatus. Just inferior to the attachment of the middle concha and just anterior to the midpoint, we see an elevation, a dome-shaped elevation in the lateral wall, and this is called the ethmoidal bulla, right? Now this ethmoidal bulla, it is formed by the underlying middle ethmoidal cells which bulge into the medial wall of the ethmoidal labyrinth. So let's see it in this diagram, right? These are the middle ethmoidal cells. They bulge into the nasal cavity and they form the bulla ethmoidalis or the ethmoidal bulla, right? And this is the middle the middle concha. So this is the middle concha and this is the middle ethmoidal cell, and here we have the dome-shaped elevation, which is the ethmoidal bulla. Now inferior to the ethmoidal bulla, we have a curved gutter-shaped structure, right? So inferior to the ethmoidal bulla, we have a curved gutter which is formed by the mucosa covering the lateral wall as it spans a defect in the bony wall, right? So let's come back to our coronal section. In a coronal section, we see that there's a bony defect between the ethmoidal bulla and the uncinate process, right? So here the mucosa covers this and it forms a sort of a gutter which is called our hiatus semilunaris. Now at the anterior end of this hiatus semilunaris, we have a sort of a channel which is called the ethmoidal infundibulum, which curves upwards, continues as the frontonasal duct through the anterior part to open into the frontal sinus, right? So we had the ethmoidal bulla, inferior to that was the hiatus seminolaris, and in the anterior part we have the ethmoidal infundibulum, which continues as the frontonasal duct into the first paranasal sinus, which is the frontal sinus. Now in the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris, we see the opening of the maxillary sinus. And at the superior part of the ethmoidal bulla, we see the opening of the middle ethmoidal air sinuses. Okay, so let's see it in the coronal section again. This was our ethmoidal bulla. Now the ethmoidal bulla, just inferior to that, is a semilunar hiatus. Now this, in its posterior part, it receives opening from the maxillary sinus. Then we also saw receiving from the frontal sinus, and we also saw the middle ethmoidal cells opening into the semilunar hiatus. Finally, now let's go on to the last meatus, which is the superior meatus, which is also the smallest one, as you can see. This is covered by the superior conchae, and if we were to cut the superior conchae and visualize it, we would see the openings of the posterior ethmoidal air sinuses. Also, just superior meatus, or sort of just posterior-superior to the superior meatus, we see the sphenoethmoidal recess, right? So the sphenoethmoidal recess, it's sort of a triangular shaped fossa lying above the superior meatus, and it receives the opening of the sphenoidal air sinuses, right? So let's just quickly revise all the structures that we have seen draining into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. In this diagram, we can see that in the anterior 1/3 and between the posterior 2/3 of the inferior meatus, we saw the opening of the nasolacrimal duct. Then we saw that the frontal sinus via the frontonasal duct and the ethmoidal infundibulum drains into the hiatus semilunaris in the anterior portion. We saw that the maxillary sinus drains into the hiatus semilunaris in the posterior portion. Then the middle ethmoidal cells, they usually open above the ethmoidal bulla, and also finally the posterior ethmoidal cells, which open just into the superior meatus, right? So the nasolacrimal duct in the inferior meatus, in the middle meatus we have the frontonasal duct, the maxillary sinus, and the middle ethmoidal cells, and in the superior meatus we have the posterior ethmoidal cells. The only paranasal sinus which doesn't drain into the lateral cavity is the sphenoidal air sinus, right? This drains into the superior posterior part of the lateral cavity. So with this, we are done with all the structures that contribute and form the lateral nasal cavity. Let's just quickly go over the clinical anatomy relevant to this. So the first thing we see is that common cold or rhinitis is the most common infection of the nose and usually results in the hypertrophy of the mucosa over the inferior nasal concha. Okay, so the most common feature of allergic rhinitis is the hypertrophy of the mucosa, and since we saw that the inferior meatus is also the largest nasal passage, it is often characterized by sneezing and nasal blockage. Apart from that, the paranasal sinuses, which open into the lateral cavity, they may get infected from the nose, and the most common of such infections is the maxillary sinusitis. Also, the relations of the nose to the anterior cranial fossa through the cribriform plate and to the lacrimal apparatus through the nasolacrimal duct are important in the spread of infection. So we'll just go over this in our coronal section again. We see that the nasolacrimal duct, it opens in the inferior meatus, right? And superiorly, we have the cribriform plate, which is connected to the anterior cranial fossa. So both of these can be a source of spread of infection. So with this, we have concluded our lecture on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Let's just quickly revise what we have learned so far. We saw that the lateral wall, first of all, was quite complex. Its relations superiorly were the orbit, inferiorly the maxillary sinus. We saw the bones contributing to it, which were the superior, middle, and inferior conchae. Superior, middle, and inferior conchae. We saw there was unchinate process, then the ethmoidal labyrinth, and sphenoid, lacrimal, and maxillary bones as well. We saw the cartilages contributing to it. Then we moved on to the conchae and meatuses, where we saw that there were 3 conchae and 3 meatuses, which were directed infero-medially. The superior and the middle conchae were projections from the ethmoidal labyrinth, while the inferior was an independent bone. We saw all the structures opening into the inferior meatus, the middle meatus, and the superior meatus as well. So I hope that you learned something from this lecture, and in the next video, which is the final video on the nasal cavity, we will go over the arterial supply, the innervation, the venous drainage, and the lymphatic drainage of the lateral wall and the nasal septum. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next lecture. Have a good day.